Hello, good evening, everybody. I hope you are doing well, sitting comfortably. Today, we are going to be talking about Star Wars, in particular, reactionary themes in Star Wars. Now, by reactionary, there's a number of definitions, but the one I'm kind of tending towards today is that which reacts against the anti modern themes, which don't belong in the current um, liberal order paradigm or framework, but rather seek a return to maybe older traditional values or the need of a restoration or revolution of some kind. And the, the themes that I'm going to focus on, I think we can see them very clearly within the stories of Star Wars. These may be things that George Lucas didn't see himself or wouldn't have necessarily put in the way that I'm going to put them today, but they're there within the story. And so we're going to draw out a few of them. It's not going to be exhaustive, just a few of the reactionary themes. And this might pave the way for a future video with some other guests to discuss more. Before we get to that, though, the opening music video that you will have seen, that was by Higher Love, and it's a wee demo track that he's done. He's a guy making music in this sphere, so I'd encourage you to check out his stuff. The links in the description. I really wanted to play it again today because of the opening shot of the couple staring at the sun, and it made me think of Luke Skywalker looking into the twin suns, right? That famous scene. And I wondered if it was influenced at all by that. Maybe, maybe. Anyway, without further ado, let me get straight into it. So I'm only going to focus on the original series and the prequels. I'm not going to look at anything beyond those films. So none of the books or the TV shows or the Clone Wars and so on. I'm not looking at the uh, Disney products either. It's really just the major feature films, which I think. Well, there's debates about this. Some people will say Lucas, he had it all planned out or a rough plan from the very beginning. Others think, well, actually, he didn't have that much of a plan. It kind of developed over time. He kind of did the first one and then um, took it from there. I think we can see development, and we'll point to some of the areas of change as we go. But in general, there's a certain tone, perhaps, that we can trace that I think's persistent throughout. And one of these is a certain anti-technological focus. Now, this might sound a rather strange thing to say because, uh, you know, Star Wars is, although it's set in the past, it's science fiction. The world that it takes place in is filled with technological gadgets far exceeding our own time. For example, the existence of robots and droids who are able to operate uh, as effectively sentient life forms, uh, fulfilling their functions and engaging in conversation. We don't have anything quite like that at the moment. You've also got spaceships and blaster guns, various speeders on planets, and so on. So, in some ways, it sounds strange to say it's anti-technological. This is a world in which far surpasses our own technology to large degrees. Yet, at the same time, it does seem that throughout the films, there's at least a reticence to trust in technology or to see technology as representative of attitudes which are harmful to society. At the same time, though, we should be clear: it's not a Luddite film. It's not a film which seeks the destruction of technology. It's not something like Dune with the Butlerian Jihad. It's not a kind of Uncle Ted thing. There is still space for technology within Star Wars. It's more that society shouldn't trust in technology as the fundamental source of its power. And the first film And by that I mean Star Wars, which later becomes A New Hope, Episode 4. This actually is one of the driving features of the plot. It's actually critical to the plot, this question. And we could pose it like this: choose the Force or choose technology. Which will be your weapon? I think that is really, you don't see that in future films, and we'll get to it. But in the original film, that becomes the key moment, the decision, and it's something that's built up throughout the film as a key kind of debate. So let's kind of get into the nuts and bolts of it a wee bit. So in the original Star Wars, and I'm just taking the original Star Wars as a self-contained film at the moment. Towards the beginning, Luke Skywalker, who's a farm boy, he's living with his uncle and aunt on a farm, and he wants to escape. He wants to go and be a pilot, perhaps with the Imperials, the Empire, and he buys a couple of droids to help on the farm, and one of them seems to have a message for Obi-Wan Kenobi. Well, the only Kenobi he knows is Ben Kenobi, and so eventually they end up meeting. And Ben, who's a kind of mentor, Merlin wizard kind of figure, they're talking about Luke's father was a Jedi, and that he had a lightsaber, and the conversation moves to a discussion of the Force. And Kenobi describes the Force as follows: the Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, penetrates us, and binds the galaxy together. So um, the Force is a kind of spiritual reality. It emanates from creatures, but it's not the same as creatures. It's well in the Bible, the Apostle Paul talks about God as being that which we move in and have our being. That it's this transcendent reality which somehow is integrated in every part of life, but is not identical with the material world. In the Star Wars world, this kind of reality that we live in and move and have our being, it it proceeds from the material world. It's a kind of just on this quotation. It's a kind of, it exists because there are living things, essentially. So it's somewhat. I'm trying to think of the right word, because pantheist is probably the wrong word here, because pantheism sees to a certain degree God as the universe. This seems to be this force emerges from the universe in a way, but it also is not of the same plane as the material. It's it's difficult to describe because it isn't defined, and I think that's part of the point. It's something that you live with, that you engage with. You can't systematize it and categorize it, because it doesn't belong to those kind of the objective reality in that respect. It is external to us. It's an external metaphysical reality, but it's not something which um, is open to kind of objective experience in that respect. It's something that only a few people can truly engage with, such as a Jedi. And that's where he gets his power. A few scenes later, the Imperial officers on the Death Star are debating the threat posed by the rebels to the Death Star. They're sitting in a conference room, and one of them saying, you're underestimating the threat of the rebellion. They've got the technical data to this battle station. They could pose us a threat in the future. Then there's this other chap, this very arrogant fellow, who's saying, uh, he dismisses the danger, and he says, no matter the technical data obtained by the rebels, this station is now the ultimate power in the universe. And the Death Star is a battle station, right? It's like a small moon. It gets described as later in the film, but um, it's that which the Empire is building to protect itself, and we'll see its power in a few scenes time. But Darth Vader then enters the room and he rebukes the officer. And remember, at this point, we don't know all of the lore behind Darth Vader. In the original film, we just know he's a fallen Jedi, as Ben Kenobi said, and that he helped to kill off the Jedi. He says, "Don't be too proud of this technological terror you have constructed. The ability to destroy a planet, which is what the Death Star can do, is insignificant next to the power of the Force." The officer then responds in what I think is, if you were an officer in the Empire, this was probably the worst thing you could ever do to Vader. He decides to mock Vader's sorcerous ways and sad devotion to an ancient religion that has failed to produce results, i.e., he's been unable to retrieve the Death Star plans thus far. So we're seeing that there's a dichotomy being posed by the film now. You've got the Force on the one hand, the power from which a Jedi draws his power, and the Death Star and technology in general, which, whereas the Force proceeds from life, the energy from life, the Death Star kills planets, it destroys life. So technology is seen as an oppressive force here, as against but then it's not just the Force. The Force is being identified here with religion and magic. So it's already connecting us to discussions about the relationship between modernity and pre-modern. In the pre-modern world, people believed in magic, in sorcerers and witches, and the ability to use potions and commune with spirits. That the world wasn't just um, well, Owen Barfield had this idea of original participation. In the pre-modern mind, in his view, people would talk about the same reality in a multiplicity of ways. So whereas we might see wind, spirit, and breath as metaphors of one another, for the pre-modern, wind, spirit, and breath are refer to the same realities. And so this allows for a concept of the world where spiritual forces can be the same as and combined with material. Um, this kind of reference that the or insult that the officer is making is essentially attacking um, the way of life and thinking prior to the modern age as we have it. Whereas in his view, all that matters is the material reality and the skill to develop and construct a technology which can move us into the future, move us towards our destination. We don't need religion now. We've got technology. And in effect, when you read uh, transhumanists like David Pearce or somebody like Yuval Harari and his kind of emphasis on data today, there is a strong push to say, well, actually, through the power of technology, we will be able to progress to such a point that all our needs will be met, whether that's physical, spiritual, and we will not need religion at all. Indeed, for some we've already reached that point. I think of somebody like Steven Pinker. So this kind of criticism isn't just about uh, you know um, which is the more powerful, the force or technology, but is actually the insult is typical of moderns in relation to the spiritual and the religious life. It's seen as superfluous because we have a better technology. Now, there's this great moment following this, and Vader responds almost immediately by force choking this officer for his arrogance and blindness. The officer, Vader does this, he's doing that, and the officer starts choking, and Vader, um, one of his great lines, he says, "I find your lack of faith disturbing." Tarkin, Grand Moff Tarkin, forces Vader to stop choking the man. But this is the first time we see a proper demonstration of the Force's ability. Now, of course, this isn't quite on the level of destroying a planet, but it shows us that it's not just a made up thing. Vader somehow has this power to choke somebody across a room without touching them. So there's something to it that this officer hasn't allowed for in his materialist mindset. So then we move forward to Luke training as a Jedi. He and Obi-Wan have got on the ship, the Millennium Falcon, which is being piloted by Han Solo, and they're trying to get to Alderaan. And Luke is training. He's got a little training droid which is shooting little blasters at him. Not very powerful, I guess they a little bit of pain. And he's got a lightsaber, and he's trying to block these. And Luke keeps getting hit. He's finding it very frustrating. Ben tells Luke, that the Jedi feels the Force flowing through him, that it controls your actions, and it also obeys your commands. So this idea that, there's a number of things here. The first is, and this kind of repeats, that when we talk about the Force being flowing through, using your feelings, there's this emphasis on quietening the mind, getting rid of discursive thought, and allowing instinct or intuition to be the guiding principle. And so this connects with ideas of meditation, right? That you're trying to silence your rationality so that that which is underneath reason, or maybe encompasses reason or goes beyond reason, can be accessed. You find this in a number of traditions, such as medieval Catholicism and the mystical practices there, where the emphasis was on quietening all faculties so that you could experience the love of God, because it's all of our faculties are created, so you need to remove them so you can experience this. There could also be an idea of, the Enlightenment had its emphasis upon reason. Reason will be the guide to all that we need. Reason is the foundation rock, and if we use reason, we can reach the truth and thus move beyond our current state. And it's very much tied in with this technological progress that we were talking earlier. Whereas actually, in the kind of reactionary or conservative mindset, reason, abstract reason, is not the foundation. Actually, it's intuition is one of the pillars, custom is another. That there's things which we don't need to justify on a rational basis for them to have validity. And so there is this kind of sense that the one who follows reason alone has not access to this spiritual life, because they're trying to use a faculty which doesn't lend itself in that way. Then we move on to one of the other aspects. So the Force controls your actions and obeys your commands. So the Force isn't just a passive thing; it actually directs you, and it can shape your life. You could call this fate, you could call it providence, but it seems that it is something which has a will of its own. But at the same time, this will is not it's not absolute, in the sense that it overrides your being. You can actually cooperate with the Force, as it were. Where Yoda talks about the Force being his ally in the Empire Strikes Back, and that's how he's able to achieve things. So you could see this as a cooperative relationship between a Jedi and the Force. Han Solo laughs at the fact that Luke is getting shot by this droid, And he says, hokey religions and ancient weapons are no match for a good blaster at your side. He doesn't believe in one all powerful force controlling everything. There's no mystical energy that controls my destiny. So we can see Han Solo is a kind of Gen Xer before Gen X. He's so cynical about life. He's um, he doesn't think that there's much worth fighting for apart from his own self-interest, and he's come to the conclusion that ultimately all that matters is as long as you've got technology on your side, something you could use to defend yourself. That's all you need. Moreover, he's a skeptic about the Force. He feels that he's in control of his destiny, not some spiritual reality. And it's interesting that he puts that in the context of what he's seen. So it's based on his experience. He's never experienced the Force. He's never seen a religion or an ancient weapon help in his line of work. So it's not important. And you could see this in terms of the broad materialist critique of the idea of the transcendent is, well, we don't observe the transcendent in our everyday interactions. It's not part of the world that we experience, so therefore it can't be. Now, of course, the rejoinder would be, well, actually, you can't just experience it. You actually need some idea of training to experience this transcendent reality. You need to undergo some sort of internal reformation. Carlyle talks about this, that most of us are not predisposed to apprehend that which is higher than the material. We would need to undergo a very painful moral transformation so that we can then both uh, spiritually see the moral law and follow it. We're not naturally prone to it. So this idea, okay, well, we don't experience it, therefore it's not there. It doesn't seem quite right. And Obi-Wan responds to Han saying, in my experience, there's no such thing as luck. So in his view, this is just totally nonsense what Han Solo is saying. Just because he's never experienced it doesn't mean that it is all just coincidence and chance. Actually, there is a direct guiding power, and he knows it to be true. He's got a strong relationship with the Force, of course. But again, we're seeing this question being posed to the audience. Should we be trusting in the Force, or should we be trusting in technology? We've seen it on the one hand with the Imperials debating this. Now we're seeing it with the rebels, as it were. Which way is the right way for us to win in the conflict? A few scenes later, we see that the Death Star destroys Alderaan, the planet Alderaan, where they were going, or Alderaan. So we can see that it is a planet destroyer, that it can kill an entire people. And on the Death Star itself, the crew end up on the Death Star. Obi-Wan and Darth Vader end up in the duel. And Kenobi says to him, "You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I will become more powerful than you can possibly imagine." When Darth Vader strikes him down, Obi-Wan Kenobi's body disappears. Now, this is really important for the climax of the movie. At the kind of climax, Luke must destroy the Death Star, and a bit before it destroys the Rebel base. He must do this because although there's other pilots there, he seems to be the only one that's left at the end of it. He must go down a trench run and make a 1 in a million shot, that's what Han Solo calls it, into a shaft which will blow up the battle station. So as he's doing this, he's getting chased as well by stormtroopers in the TIE fighters and by Darth Vader as well. And As he's about to take the shot, he's got his targeting computer up, he's ready to go, and he hears Ben Kenobi's voice. Use the Force, Luke. Let go. Luke, trust me. Luke responds. He turns off his targeting equipment. He also loses R2D2. R2D2 gets shot. So his technological computer assistant is gone. The rebels say, Luke, your targeting equipment's been turned off. Is everything okay? Luke says, yep, everything's okay. Using the Force, letting go of his discursive thought, just trusting in his feelings, Luke makes the shot, and it lands. It goes down the reactor, and the Death Star is destroyed, and the rebels are saved. Afterwards, Han praises the 1 in a million shot, and Ben's voice returns. Remember, the Force will be with you, always. Vader's warning, I guess, has come true. The technological terror of the Death Star cannot overcome the power of the Force. How to put it? There's so many things to say here. First is, so Ben's kind of becoming one with the Force. In his death, he ascends into that energy, and he's able to personify it in a way. He's able to speak through it to Luke at the right time and influence Luke. Nobody else can hear this. It's not on the radio comms or anything. It's very much within Luke's mind, and he's able to kind of move him emotionally. And this to me seems very similar to the way that the gods interact with people in the Iliad, for example, or in Norse mythology. That in the midst of battle, for example, you have characters who, like Diomedes, who Athena appears to and gives him a fervor to go and fight the Trojans. And with this kind of zeal that she's put in his heart through her words, he's able to drive the Trojans back towards the city walls, and he is almost unstoppable. It takes a god, Ares, to stop him, essentially. So we have this idea of divine powers interfering and engaging with an individual to give them power that they wouldn't normally have, to kind of open up them to their fullest abilities to take on a foe. You could also see this maybe with the concept of a berserker. So the berserkers receive a kind of frenzy, a furor, and this is connected with the idea of Odin. Odin being this divine possession, and with it, they're able to withstand much punishment and deal out a great deal of rage and vengeance. They're great warriors. So I think that's definitely in play at this point with Luke. We have the question between technology and the Force being resolved. It's actually trusting in the Force, letting go of rationality and technology, putting away the targeting computer, and trusting in his instincts, that Luke is able to make the shot, which, nearly every pilot would have failed just using the targeting equipment and the kind of thinking process. And through doing so, he's able to destroy a planet-killing machine. And so this question is critical to the plot. The choice of the Force leads to victory. If he didn't choose to trust in the Force, if he had rejected Ben at that point, then the rebels all would have been killed. The Death Star would have blown up the rebel base. Luke probably would have been hunted down. And that would have been that. This is the only time I think this question, technology or the Force, what do you trust in for your victory? That's the only time in the franchise where it's critical to the plot. We'll see examples of how technology is a kind of anti-technological approach is seen in other movies, but it's never again the vital question of the movie. In this case, it is something which advances the plot to its resolution. What the hero decides in regards to this question has an impact on how the end, the story ends. Whereas elsewhere, it doesn't have that same role. Lucas kind of moves the question away from that. And the best comparison would be something like, um, well, both Return of the Jedi and The Phantom Menace. In those cases, you have a similar situation where there is a planet killing Death Star again being built in Return of the Jedi, or the droid battleship which controls the droid army in the battle in Naboo. In both cases, they get blown up again. But in neither cases is it incumbent upon the hero to make a choice about whether they use the Force or not in destroying those battle stations. In the case of Return of the Jedi, all the Force stuff is going on in the throne room between Emperor Vader and Luke Skywalker. The destruction of the Death Star isn't impacted by the question of the Force. It's done by Lando, who's just a good pilot. In The Phantom Menace, you have Anakin Skywalker, as the film says, but he doesn't have to make a choice. It's never put like that. It's not like use the Force, Luke. It's just he's good at flying, and it's actually more connected with pod racing, his ability to fly a pod racer. Now that is said to be due to his reflexes are due to the Force, but it's not a choice he has to make. I think that's the point I'm trying to get across. It's not something where he has to decide, I will use the Force instead of the technological equipment I could to make this shot. That's only in the original Star Wars. And I think it's a great thing because it's really challenging the viewer to think, okay, we have all of these technological supplements in our lives, and it's so much more than today than it was when Star Wars was made in the 1970s. But that isn't the strongest power in the universe. It's not the strongest power in our lives, and it can only get you so far. Actually, without the transcendent, without something higher, you're always limited, and you'll always be overcome by that which is transcendent and higher. You need to rely on those powers more than the technological. Otherwise, because they are more powerful, and so you will be living a better life for it, and you'll be able to overcome the dark power which just relies on technology. So let's kind of move on from that film to see how this kind of anti-technological bent is seen in kind of across other films. So you have in episodes 5 and 6, Luke begins training to use the Force under the tutelage of Yoda. But the climax of the film isn't so much about whether he should use the Force rather than technology, but whether he's ready to use the Force, whether he's trained well enough, and how whether he will join the dark side or not. Whether when Vader invites him to join him to defeat the Emperor, will he do so or not? That's the heartbeat, the key decision he has to make in that movie. But nevertheless, there is this kind of anti-materialist side to it. First, Yoda contrasts the Force with this crude matter, as he calls it, our skin and bone. He says we're not just made of that, we're actually luminous beings who are one with all of our surroundings, and that is the true nature of the Force. This is contrasted with Vader in a certain way, because while in the first film we don't really know much about Vader, in the second one we begin to see that he's actually a scarred man. We see the back of his head at one point. That the suit that he wears is a machine which helps to keep him alive. And without this machine, he would surely die. So there's this idea of, and in the third film, Obi-Wan describes Vader as more machine than man. And this is in connection to his evil, that he has become evil and twisted by the dark side of the Force. So there's this idea that the machine, and this isn't so much in the first one, but in 5 and 6, that the machine is a visualization of the diminishment of a human being who turns to evil, that they become less than human, that they become nothing more than a robotic thing. It's actually in uh, a character like Luke, who's willing to give up power to help others, to love other people, that you see true humanity. So this kind of reality also gets seen in the fact that rushing ahead, going beyond his training, risking the dark side of the Force, Luke loses his hand and it gets replaced by a robotic hand that he has put on. So again, we see this kind of darkness being visualized through the robotic. At the end of Return of the Jedi, Vader has been redeemed. He saw the suffering of Luke at the hands of the Emperor and killed the Emperor. In the process, he was fatally wounded. But as he's dying, he asks Luke to take off his helmet so that he can see him with his own eyes. And so again, we're seeing the visualization here. The redemption of Vader is tied to his desire to be outside of his suit, that you can see his flesh, that he's a real living human being. And although he can't fully come back, he's still wearing this suit. The taking off of the helmet makes a big difference, I think. It's showing us that, oh, he has changed. So again, we've got this connection. And maybe we could tie this into a broader idea that I meant to mention earlier. That, I said the Force proceeds from life. Technology in this film is used for death. The Death Star kills planets. The suit that Vader wears is oppressive. When he's redeemed, he wants to take it off. All of these things point towards the idea that technology is a force which crushes life. It's used to, um, it's used to diminish us to be less than human and indeed kill us in various ways. You could, well, I'll come to this more fully in due course with the prequels because I think it's even clearer there. Um, but I think that's quite marked that it's a fully destructive force, especially given today. If as I was mentioning, we're constantly told technology is the cure to our problems. That if we just keep developing in technology, if we just keep allowing technology to run our lives and make decisions for us, then things will get better. That things will always improve the more we invest in technology. This is Tony Blair's line, right? He says we've got a fourth technological revolution coming and we've got to embrace it. We've got to invest in it. Otherwise, we'll be left behind. And we don't want to be left behind because that's the way to our salvation. But Star Wars says no. It says, no, actually, the technological state, or the state which just invests in technology, which only sees technology as its solution, as the only thing worth caring about and resting all of its confidence on, it's an oppressive force. And I think many of us have in this sphere seen and testify to the ways in which technology is used to control us, whether it be online, monitoring our transactions, uh, through our banking, or oh, okay, you need to have a digital ID that everybody will have, and so we will be able to monitor you in that way. The Your phone is a way of tracking you. Your um, whole and in turn, it's not just the ways that technology can be used to control us by powers, but the technological in itself is oppressive. It makes us dependent upon it, and then we are unable to lose it. Uncle Ted talks about this in terms of the car. It, when the car came in, it was a voluntary choice. But now, because of the popularity of the car, many of our cities are unwalkable. They've been designed for cars now. So we become dependent upon it. And so we get into this cycle of absolute dependence upon the technology which is there to help us in theory. This is where I think a this is where things like the Matrix and the Terminator have their power, is that okay, even if we're never taken over by artificial intelligence, in a sense we are ruled by technology now because we can't choose to lose it. It doesn't seem we're able to anymore. So it has sovereignty in our lives, and all of the things that go on in our society seem to be increasingly determined by technology. Indeed, I remember there was an issue with the benefit system in the UK, that people weren't able to get certain payments, and they were told by the civil service, "Oh, it's the computer. It has a schedule, and it won't do it until a certain point." And you're just thinking, "Wait, the computer decides when the payments are given so that people can live? You can't override that?" That's a bit worrying. Uh, so, so I think it's really interesting that a film like Star Wars, a science fiction film, which isn't explicitly about technology and its dangers, definitely has a very strong reservations about how technology can be an oppressive force, a life-killing force, rather than something which is going to lead us into the future. We see this also in the prequels, and let's turn to the prequels now, which I think in some ways thematically are much richer, because the original Star Wars, as I understand it, is very much a fairy tale. It draws heavily upon Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, and has very strong universal themes of good versus evil and so on. And although I've touched on the technology and force aspect, it's the particular themes are not the focus as much. Whereas in the prequels, it seems that Lucas was trying to very much make commentary on things he saw in contemporary society. That, in some ways, meant it wasn't, always the most enjoyable bits. Some of the Senate scenes are a wee bit dragging, but in general, uh, it means that there's richer for this sort of analysis. And one of these areas is again technology and the force, or more really the dangers of technology. In the first film, the Trade Federation, because of the Republic's tax codes, I mean, not the way to start your film if you're trying to get interest, right? Unless you're appealing to the autists online. But the Trade Federation decide to invade the planet of Naboo, and they do this using a droid army. And these battle droids are sent to Naboo and conquer it. And throughout the first three films, the main antagonists, the Trade Federation, and which joins with the separatist movement in the Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, use droids as their primary foot soldiers. And these droids There's a variety of them. Some of them, the standard ones look pretty weedy. By the second film, you start seeing these big hench battle droids. In the third one, you also see droids that I think they're called Magna Guards. Is that right? Somebody will know. Who are able to use kind of lightsaber esque staffs, and there's also like the droidicars. But all of this is how to put it. Individuality does not belong to droids. They are a manufactured production line kind of existence, which um, we could characterize as eusocial. The droids are, in a sense, like an insect colony, like ants. One day I'm going to do the power politics of ant colonies. It's going to be great. Following up from the chimpanzee one, right? But the ants, at the basic level, they're a kind of superorganism. Some scholars would say they don't have a top-down structure, and by that I mean like the queen isn't sending out commands that the worker ants follow. It's very much an emergent behavior. The queen will produce different castes. Essentially, there's two castes at basic level. There are the workers and there are the queens, the future queens. The workers subdivide. There are the juniors who are just there to work, and then there are the soldiers. Now, each of these will have a degree of programming built into them, a set of kind of binary responses to multiple situations. And through these, they're able to navigate situations in a way which coheres with the operation of the rest of the ant colony. As a consequence, the ants, let's take a simple scenario. So, uh, a worker ant goes out to look for food and it finds some food. And what it does on its way back is it secretes a liquid which will communicate to other ants the nature of the food that's found, how much there is of it, its distance and direction from the colony. And so when the ant gets back to the colony, it will kind of, these pheromones are um, seen by other ants, maybe a pod of ants, larger ants who are able to go and do the work. They will then make a judgment based upon this information, whether it's worth going or not, and how many are worth going. If they decide to go, they too will leave liquid on the ground, which will inform other ants of the situation. And this will keep changing. So as time goes by, they'll secrete less because there'll be less food there to collect. And so this is how the ant colony is able to go and forage and find food and work together to achieve this. Now, this wasn't top down. No ant kind of said, okay, you're going to go out and find food and you're going to go and collect it afterwards. It was all emergent. They all responded to the situation by sending communications to one another. They were able to function as a unit and do this together. Now, I see droids in Star Wars as essentially this kind of life. They don't have um, willpower in the sense that human beings do. They couldn't go against their programming. Rather, they have a set of programming, a set of codes within them that they're able to respond to situations in pre-programmed ways. And in so doing, they're able to communicate with other droids and work together to achieve goals. Now, there's a degree of top-down because there's kind of general droids and commander droids, and then also like their masters who are giving them kind of objectives to achieve. But within the achievement of those objectives, they're not getting direct commands about how they should fight the battle, right? They're not going into battle against the Gungans, for example, with Newt Gunray telling each droid what to do. They have their programming, and through this, they're able, in a kind of emergent way, to respond to the situation in a way that benefits the whole group. They're a sort of superorganism, just like the ant colony. that self-sustains with all of these individual units. But this is, I mean, this is fine for the droids, right? But there's a bit of a criticism being made here of technology too, and capitalism. Remember, this is the Trade Federation, and I think you could read this as Lucas saying, well, capitalism, big business and industry, i.e., the Trade Federation, it will take over your planet and control it, install it using homogeneous, um, mindless drones who just follow orders, who have no culture, have no tradition, have no individuality or uniqueness, have no sense of the higher or the spiritual. Indeed, being purely robotic, they are not living beings, so they have no experience or participation in the force. They are less than human. These are the sorts of creatures which a um, big business will turn your society into, will turn people into. And if you disagree, they will destroy your culture, your tradition, they will remove your rulers and your precedents and install these bland, emotionless droids in its place. Um, we could call this undifferentiated human matter, shorn off of all of its distinctiveness and particularity in service to the economic masters and what they want. Does that not sound a bit like what we've got today? Does that not sound like what goes on in our countries, where we have, um, just talking about Britain for a second, we have so much history, we have so much, many traditions and rich cultures. We have, we have a beautiful stories and ways of life. Um, I've already, in some of my streams, the English Restoration streams, covered some of this. And so many of our towns are being gutted. So many of our ways of life are being overturned because they're not consumer friendly. They don't encourage us to spend. And so these get replaced by big businesses which have chains and stores in every town. The little quaint shops are going, and these big ones take their place. And at the same time, we exist in a culture where it doesn't really matter where you come from. You can define who you are. You can belong however you want to. It doesn't. There's no sense of collective identity. The only thing that really remains is the monarchy, and we saw how surprisingly people were emotionally moved by it in a way that I don't think many of us had ever had for a long time. That sense of collective identity in our history and tradition, because we're people of the present. We exist for our own choices, and if we are defined by our choices, well, that's the essence of consumerism. Because people then sell us things to buy. Those are our choices now. We define ourselves in terms of which CDs we buy, what clothes we wear, which football team we go and buy tickets for, etc., etc. I appreciate I'm being a wee bit kind of not as necessarily structured as I usually am, but I think that we can see that the idea of the droids as the weapons, the foot soldiers of the Trade Federation, speaks volumes of. It speaks very strongly of the kind of society that capitalism pushes us towards. And I think it's a kind of scary thing, but it's something we need to confront. We need to confront it. It's also though it's paralleled by the clone army. The clones were um, commissioned by, well, officially commissioned by Master Sifo Dyas of the Jedi Order from the Camino clone kind of manufacturers to provide an army for the Republic. Now, it turns out, I think that this was Count Dooku who actually did this, but nevertheless, this was um, kind of the official story. And the Republic, despite the fact that they seem to have no knowledge of doing this, are quite happy to accept the clone army and to pay for it. The clones are, well, they're cloned from the DNA of Jango Fett, who was a bounty hunter, and each of them has a serial number. And I use that word in particular because normally when you talk about the military, every member of the military will have a service number that they can be identified with, and also it helps to keep track of who they are and which regiments they're a part of and so on. But the clones are not just an army, they're a product. They're literally manufactured and bought by the Republic. So they have a serial number, that is, they are products with a code that can be bought and sold. These clones, again, I think that, so I'm going to be, um, I'm not talking about the Clone Wars series here because I think that does a lot to humanize the clones. But in the films, which is what most people see, in the most part, the clones have very little individuality. We don't see much of their kind of behavior beyond them just following orders. And indeed, this plays into the fact that when Order 66 is commissioned by Chancellor Palpatine, which is to kill the Jedi, the clones, for the most part, just follow orders. Now, I know that in the series, this is explained as a kind of chip within their heads, but in the films, we're not told that, right? We just see the clones on a dime follow an order to kill the people that are leading them into battle. Does this not sound like the sort of thing that droids would do? That you would just put an order into a computer and the droids would follow orders? This seems to be it seems to be the same for the clones. They're manufactured and they're kind of educated into just pursuing orders. So again, we have this concept of capitalism, because again, these are manufactured, they're on the assembly line. It produces a kind of existence which is less than human, where we only exist, essentially. We're allowed to be born so that we can produce and that we can consume. And in this case, that we can follow a system. We could be a cog in a machine, and our value is determined by our ability to be a cog in that machine. We exist for the sake of the system rather than for our families, for our children, for our husbands and wives, for our communities. No, no. We are just products to be bought and sold. We may not feel like that's the case, but in reality, you you know, you have to work so that you can pay your taxes. um, you can't just work for yourself or for your community. You have to pay for the big boss in the government. And you are pretty much forced to engage with the system. In Britain, you need permission to live off grid. It's almost impossible to just disappear into the wilderness and set up your own life. You need planning permission to build something. You may not get it. You need to pass various tests to show that you are worthy, that you have the skills to do this. I mean, how absurd is that? That you can't opt out of this system. And even if you do, you still have to pay tax in various ways. It's so there's this. We are Homo economicus. We exist purely for economic means. so that GDP can grow, that line go up, and so on. So I think this is the fact that the droids and the clones are in many ways very identical is something that is, and both are the product of big business. And I say big business, not just capitalism, because it is like assembly line manufacture that we're seeing with the clones and with the droids. Lucas is very much saying, look, there's something wrong here with the way that big business ravages human nature, makes us less than human, makes us like droids, and we will be unable to escape our programming within such a system. So I think that's like the major kind of technological stuff that we've looked at. I guess maybe one more is that the when Vader is defeated, he's so Anakin's turned to the dark side. He's defeated by Obi-Wan. That's when he gets put in his suit. Again, we're seeing a visualization of the dark side is identified with becoming like a machine and losing that losing life, essentially. So again, we see this in a visual way, and it's kind of preempted by General Grievous, who's a cyborg, a coughing cyborg. He is the prototype for what Vader is going to be. I want to move now to another theme within the story, and these two are going to be primarily about the um, the prequels, and the first is surrounding the Jedi. The Jedi, as we've heard from Obi-Wan in the original, use the Force as their ally. They're supposed to be servants of the Force. They're also guardians of justice and peace within the galaxy. At least that's how they describe themselves. And as we start the Phantom Menace, they are an institution. They're a kind of institutionalized religion. They have a council with many members. They seem to be training many young children into the order, and they are have authority in large parts of the Galactic Republic. And they are, you could say, a kind of warrior priest, if we're looking at archetypes. Think back to the Odinic stream that I did, the Odinic hero. Odin is unique in terms of mythology, ancient mythologies, because he integrates these two archetypes of the warrior god and the priest god, as it were. And I think this is very interesting because you see that manifesting in the divine possession, the frenzy idea that we referenced earlier, whether that be in a berserker or it's a kind of ecstatic experience of the numinous, the transcendent, and experiencing um, the deeper knowledge of the world and of the higher truths, as Odin was often seeking such knowledge, pursuing um, the mead which allows the ability to write poetry, or hanging upon the world tree for several nights, going through death to receive the knowledge of the runes, the language, that the written language. These two things drawing them together, the warrior and this uh, the warrior and this mystic, that's what the Jedi seem to bring together in some way or another. You could connect this with various Asian priestly castes as well. And somebody who seems to be the ideal Jedi is Qui-Gon Jinn in the first movie. He continuously talks about following the will of the Force, that his whole life is guided by the will of the Force. And indeed, in one of the books, and I'm kind of breaking away from the the rule of just sticking with the films. But in one of the books, Qui-Gon says, "I follow the light not because it will make me powerful or something like that, but because it is the light." And so there's this idea for Qui-Gon that no matter what the situation, the only thing that I am here to do is to follow the will of the Force. The Force is fully his ally, and it is the highest thing in his reality. We could see him as a kind of Carlylean great man, insofar as he's absolutely sincere in his devotion to the transcendent, to the highest, to the natural and moral laws. He will do what is right, regardless of how it looks to others, regardless of the consequences, regardless of whether it gives him power or not. He is absolutely sincere. He is a true hero. By contrast, the film presents the Jedi Order as a bureaucratic nightmare. The Jedi won't train Anakin Skywalker, who Qui-Gon found. I should let me go back a second. Qui-Gon believed Anakin, who was a slave on Tatooine, should be trained by the Jedi Order because he has the highest midichlorian count that's ever been recorded, higher than even the greatest Jedi, Yoda. And this is because midichlorians, I mean, I don't like this aspect of the Phantom Menace. I feel it was a mistake on Lucas's part. But the midichlorian count indicates that Anakin will have a oneness with the Force which surpasses most. He will be able to use the Force in a way that most people can't. He's going to be the most powerful Jedi. And indeed, Qui-Gon thinks that he will be the individual to fulfill the prophecy of bringing balance to the Force. And so he thinks it's a natural conclusion. This is the will of the Force, that this individual be trained as a Jedi. The Council, the Jedi Council, which has characters like Yoda, Mace Windu, Ki-Adi-Mundi, they refuse to train him. They do test him, but they refuse. They say that he is too old to be trained. When Qui-Gon says, "Well, I will train him myself," they say, "You can only have one one Padawan, one apprentice. The Jedi Code forbids it." And this idea of a Jedi Code, what we're seeing is that there's been a process of formalization and rationalization of the Jedi practice. Before, at its most fundamental, it's supposed to be following the will of the Force, but now it's become adherence to a set of abstract rules, which may at one time have expressed the will of the Force in certain ways for particular individuals or for groups, but now it has become a restrictive thing. The Bible says, "The letter kills, the spirit gives life." And there's a sense in which, in this case, the Jedi Order are so fixed on following their rules that they are unwilling to allow for the charismatic character of the Force to direct them. I use that word charismatic in the sense that Weber was talking about with bureaucracy and charisma. The bureaucrats are the bureaucratic system is that which operates purely on according to abstract principles and rationalization. It seeks to reduce all things to rational processes, and those who follow it are replaceable within that system. If they disobey the rules, they just get somebody else to take their place and obey the rules. By contrast, the charismatic system is one in which an individual who has a vision of life that is so forceful, and they have a strong personality, that people trust their judgments first and foremost and are willing to follow them in their decision making. So the political system becomes rooted in an individual and what they decide. So think of your tribal chief or something like that. In a sense, The Jedi should have a charismatic structure in the sense that they ought to be following the will of the Force. This living reality should be guiding what they do. Instead, and that's what Qui-Gon does, right? Instead, they say, no, we're sticking to these rigid principles, such as the kid's too old. It's patently absurd given the context. Or that Qui-Gon shouldn't train him because he's already got an apprentice, as if having two apprentices is the biggest deal in the world. It's just petty bureaucracy. And this is a theme that we actually see in the Senate during this film. When Queen Amidala comes to the Senate to receive help against the invasion of the Trade Federation, Palpatine, who's a senator at that point, advises her that the bureaucrats are going to manipulate the Chancellor to stop him from doing anything about it. We see that take place, and the Chancellor accepts a motion from the Trade Federation that a commission be sent to investigate the situation. So Palpatine explicitly says this is the bureaucrats taking over. What's needed is a strong chancellor, i.e., charismatic chancellor, who can rule the bureaucracy. And Weber thought this was totally possible, that in a democratic context, you can elect a demagogue, somebody who has a strong character and a vision of that can unite people behind them, can actually shape the officialdom to work for them, to administrate on their behalf. And that's essentially what Palpatine ends up doing. He becomes the new chancellor. But it's this criticism of bureaucracy that, a commission's not any good to the Naboo. They've been invaded. But this is the sort of thing. We need to follow the abstract process, the protocol, even if it's unjust. Same with the Jedi Order. So there is this betrayal of what they stand for, this staleness in both the Republic and in the Jedi Order that prevents them from well they've lost what their vital spark. And for Carlyle, I think for Weber too, these things will very quickly be overthrown when that happens with something which does have a vital spark. We also see with the Jedi Order a kind of fanaticism, ironically enough. I've just called them bureaucrats, but they're blinded to reality. Orwell, in his essay on nationalism, talks about this aspect, and by nationalism he doesn't just mean an overabundant zealousness for one's country. He means more generally, I think, ideology, or being overly ideological. So he would call something like communism a form of nationalism in this sense. And one of its features is that you're unable to countenance or even recognize facts which go against your beliefs. So, for example, the communists in England during the kind of 1930s would ignore and probably couldn't even really acknowledge or apprehend the Holodomor, the kind of mass genocide of the Ukrainians by the Soviets through starvation. They just couldn't mention it. It just didn't, either because they didn't want to talk about it, or it just doesn't register, it doesn't impact upon their thinking. And we see this with the Jedi. The Kayadi, is it Kayadi? Yeah, Kayadi Mundi and Mace Windu, when Qui-Gon tells them he's just fought somebody who he thinks is a Sith Lord, Kayadi Mundi says, the Sith have not been around for 1,000 years, or generations. And Mace says, I do not think the Sith could have returned without us knowing it. There's a sense that, okay, somebody who's on the ground, like Qui-Gon, has just fought this individual who has first-hand experience of them and thinks it could be a Sith. Or just dismiss it out of hand. It can't be. It can't. There's no way it could be true. It's it's um it's this kind of ideological um, closed-mindedness to reality, which again ties in with bureaucracy, right? Because if it's fitting to abstract principles and not a living force which might force you to change your perspective and your activities, well, then I think it then naturally follows that if something kind of interruptive comes into your sphere, you just have to dismiss it as not being true. It's also hubris, of course, and that's very closely tied to the ideological character that we've been mentioning. The Jedi, especially someone like Mace Windu, is so wrapped up in their own abilities and think that they are almost unassailable that they're unwilling to recognize their own flaws and weaknesses and thus the threats that face them. And I mean that's difficult for anybody, right? I don't think many of us are very good at kind of recognizing our flaws and forcing ourselves to reform. Never mind groups in power. That's a really hard thing to do. And we can see but it's a necessary process because without that reform, they've lost their connection to the Force. And so we see in future movies that Yoda will say things like, "The dark side clouds our judgment." And Mace Windu even says, I, "We may have to warn the Republic that the Jedi can no longer use the Force as we once did, that we can't see clearly as we once did." So they recognize there's a problem, but they're unwilling to change to meet that demand. They don't think their conduct and their way of life is the issue, and it very much is. And this raises then the question, okay, they're following these new abstract principles. They're no longer serving the Force, the will of the Force. What are they serving? Well, we are told the Republic. Or, as Obi-Wan says in confrontation with Anakin, democracy. It's a system of government and a particular faction. And this comes to its clearest during the Clone War. The Clone War begins on Geonosis when the Jedi go to rescue Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Padme from execution. But during the Clone War, the Jedi take a leading position. They become the commanders of the clone armies. These are individuals who claim to be for peace and justice, who are essentially the directors of military action against those who oppose the Republic. There's just so many levels to kind of talk about here. The first is they're supposed to be servants of the will of the Force. Never once is it made clear that defending the Republic is the will of the Force. Indeed, the Clone War itself is very much a Republic motivated war. The Separatists essentially just want to leave the Republic. They just want to have their own group, their own independence from the Republic. The Jedi and the Republic are determined to make sure that they don't leave. They're incessant that they cannot leave, and so we'll fight them until they are forced to submit. Now, of course, Sidious is in the background, right? Darth Sidious is playing both sides against each other, so that's partly why the war continues. But why are the Jedi so supportive of the Republic? Why do they feel it's improper for people to have independence from a political institution? I mean, one can't help but think of the European Union and Brexit on this point. The Jedi would be invading Britain on behalf of the European Union to ensure that we remained part of the European Union, even if we had a referendum. So much for democracy. And I think I think this is very much an elite theory point. We could see this um, connecting with the de Juvenel's idea that those in power always seek to increase their power. They never seek to lose any, and they're never accepting of losing any. If there are is a central power and there are subsidiary powers, that is kind of rival castles, then the main castle is going to go and take those over until it controls them all. The Jedi very much seem to be of this mind. They have a status within the Republic as the chief military force, the chief power, and they don't want to lose that power. They don't want to lose their influence over the separatist planets. So they're willing to, in the name of their lust for power, they're willing to, um, well, in defense of their lust for power, they're willing to invade a number of places using clones, and I, I think that shows as well that their political formula of the will of the force, of defending democracy, these things are post hoc rationalizations of their will to power. They talk about democracy. They're not willing to let sovereign nations leave a republic of their own free choice. They're going to militarily force them to remain within the republic. Democracy, guys. it's um it's the lie that you have a choice. Actually, you have a choice as long as it is for us. This gets even worse in Revenge of the Sith, right? Because the Jedi discover, well, before they discover that the Chancellor is a Sith Lord, they discuss plans to remove the Chancellor following the end of the war. They say that he's far exceeded his term in office, and so once the war is over, then they will have to remove the Chancellor by force, and the Jedi will have to take over the Republic, the running of the Republic, to secure a peaceful transition. Let's just think about that for a second. I know we're supposed to think the Jedi's are the good guys. They are going to um, militarily remove a democratically elected leader he's gone beyond his term in office, but the emergency powers he was given were given by the Senate. This religious cult is going to come in, swoop in to the White House, as it were, the Chancellor's palace, remove him and take over and install their own a leader that they think is appropriate. The idea that these people um, are democratic is very laughable, but also reveals that they see they have a right to exert their power and influence over the republic. As long as the republic works in a way that they want, they're willing to say to not be the official sovereign. But as soon as the apparent ruler oversteps his mark, the Jedi intervene, and this gets played out when Mace Windu discovers that the Chancellor is a Sith Lord, that he is Darth Sidious. He goes to confront him and arrest him. Now, let's just be clear again on this point. In the movies, and let's be clear, in the movies, we're never told what's so bad about the Sith at this point, and we don't see what's bad about the Sith. I know in extended universe and books there are discussions about the tyranny of the Sith in the past, but in this we don't really hear about that. We just know that they are supposed to be the enemies of the Jedi. They're a different religious group. And so and remember, with though we know that the Sith end up being the leaders of the Empire and the Emperor isn't, he's a bit of an evil guy, he blows up planets, We don't know that yet in the story, and the Jedi don't know that yet in the story. At this point, we have a Chancellor who has a different religious belief to the Jedi, and because of his religious beliefs, they are willing to arrest him. And then, when Mace Windu beats Palpatine in a combat, he's willing to execute him at that point. He's willing to kill a democratically elected leader because he doesn't agree with his religious point of view. And this religious point of view would definitely wipe out kind of the Jedi influence within the Republic. Because if the Sith take over fully, well, they're not going to have the Jedi in such authority. So I think you can see that the Jedi, in this case, for all their protestations about justice and so on, it does seem like power is the motivating factor. It's their power, and what they want to see has to be implemented. And Sidious, in conversation with Anakin, makes this point. There's that famous scene where um, they're watching the opera, and everybody remembers the story of Darth Pelagius, right? Have you ever heard the story of Darth Pelagius the Wise? But before that point, they're kind of having an elite theory conversation. And Palpatine says, he reminds Anakin that all that have power are afraid to lose it. And then says, well, the Jedi and the Sith are almost identical, including that their desire for power. Now, Anakin says, well, a Jedi uses his power for good. Sidious says, well, actually, they just use power for their own interest. And Anakin reports, actually, no, in his view, Jedis are meant to use their powers selflessly, not thinking of themselves, but acting for other people. And indeed, maybe this is in part why the idea of the Force requires the removal of our discursive thought, the quietening of our minds to allow our feelings to flow, right? To be in tune with the Force, because these attachments, when you're attached to something, it blocks you from just going with the flow. You're thinking about that interest in particular. So that I think that's how you tie it with the desire for a lack of attachment in the Jedi Code with being totally open to the will of the Force. Somebody like Qui-Gon has this. But the point that's being made is that the Jedi are hungry for power. And I think Anakin comes to see this, that though the ideal of the Jedi is selflessness, as we see with Qui-Gon, as we see with Luke, in practice, the Jedi's, because they've lost, they no longer serve the will of the Force, but rather the will to power. They are willing to do things for the pursuit of power in the Revenge of the Sith. So, I mean, it does raise questions about is this fundamentally what all politics is like? Or is the fall of the Jedi, could they have been different? I guess is the question. That's De Juvenile would say no. Actually, because of their position, because they had power, they acted like this. It just flows from that. But if somebody like Qui-Gon Jinn had been head of the Jedi Order, would they have acted differently in that situation? Would they have gone to arrest and kill the Chancellor? Would they have got involved in the Clone Wars? I don't think they would have if Qui-Gon was the leader. But that's just speculation. So we've kind of covered, I think, three major themes, reactionary themes within the films. The first is the anti-technological, the idea that technology isn't the route to salvation, technological innovation and implementation, but actually one should turn to spirituality, to ancient religions, which will help us to engage with the transcendent. From this, all else follows. The sacred order is the heart and the beating heart of what gives us power in life. The second is the theme of charisma versus bureaucracy, the desire to follow the transcendent sincerely, and the dangers of formalization and bureaucratization within religion, and how that vital spark can be lost when it's codified in certain ways. And finally, we've touched on the idea that all politics is essentially motivated by a desire for power, and how this could be, maybe this isn't so much a reactionary theme as a elite theory theme. I think that's yeah. Hmm. Well, it's in our kind of conversations at the moment, isn't it? I guess what if you were an elite theorist, you would see this as, the natural course of things, that the Jedi are, their ideology is a mask for their desire for power. It seems to be borne out. But the question we've kind of raised through kind of at the end of the stream is in relation to the other two themes. Well, if they had been sincere, would it have turned out differently? Um, and that's probably one of the big things at the moment is this kind of debate between those who think that all politics is driven by a desire for power, and those who think that ideology, or maybe something less than ideology, that values, intuition, instinct, as we've been talking about, can these things be a motivation for political action? And if so, then the fall of the Jedi is not just the ordinary course, but because they departed from the way. So that's quite important implications, that sort of discussion, because it me it raises a question of whether they were redeemable or not, or whether they could have taken a different course of action. If you think it's all just desire for power, the Jedi couldn't have done any differently, I think. But if there are other things which can motivate, which I think Star Wars suggests in its very being, with its very criticisms of the Jedi, then maybe somebody will need to write that fan fiction. So I think we will leave the kind of analysis there, and I'll look at some of the super chats and what's been going on in the chat. Please feel free to put questions and comments in there. Please like and subscribe as well. It makes a huge difference to the channel, and it in part because YouTube thinks, as I understand it, see, this is a problem with technology, right? With the droids that run us, is that if you don't engage with this video with a like or subscribe in some way, or send a super chat or become a member or whatever, it makes the system thinks that you didn't enjoy this video or didn't like it, and so it won't recommend this content to you in the future. So it makes a huge difference if you can support it. So I really appreciate it if you can, because I hope you are enjoying it, because it's, if you want more things like this in the future, it really helps. So please do. So first, let me come to super chats first, and then we will do the broader chat as well. So let's see. Quite a number tonight. Thank you, guys. Thank you. So, Vulpes Inculta, good to see you, sir. For £4.49, a good currency there. Droids treated with disdain as lower sentience, rightly so. R2D2, the most virtuous droid, and C3PO, most accidentally virtuous droid, are seen as silly. Yes, quite so. They are constantly ridiculed and mocked by the rest of the cast. They are, you know, when they mess up, Luke's like in A New Hope, Luke's on the intercom and he's trying to get them to stop the trash compactor from crushing them. And it's like, oh, where's that droid now? That silly droid. It's very much like when a piece of technology doesn't work and you get frustrated with it. Why is my computer not working right now? Why can I not get Wi-Fi connection? It's very frustrating. It's so they are seen as they're not real companions. They're R2D2 and C3PO. They give a kind of human element to the droids. They try to humanize them because they do have a degree of will. I suppose they're unlike the battle droids. But their kind of friendship, it's very much their friends. They are friends together. They don't really have friends beyond each other. I think Luke and R2D2 perhaps are friends in a sense, but in general they are treated as tools. And you see this most clearly, actually, and dare I mention it, the Rise of Skywalker. All of the people in that film are constantly harassing C3PO and shouting at him and just treating him like absolute dirt. And there's that moment where C3PO gives up his life, essentially. Um, he's going to have his memory erased so that they can move forward with the quest. And he says, I'm so glad. Yeah, at least I'm dying with my friends. And there's like no emotion in any of their faces. They don't care. They don't care about this droid. He's just there to do a job for them. And in a way, I think this is typical of Disney Star Wars because you look at Solo, where they have what was her name? There was a droid. I mean, even calling a droid a her is kind of ridiculous. But the there was a droid in that film which wanted to lead a droid rebellion for equal rights. Nothing could be further from Lucas's vision than this. It's um, it's just nonsense. So I think um, yes, it's a constant theme of they are well, they're not even a lower class. I think that's the point. When you start talking about droids as a class, you're humanizing them. You're making them like others. They're not alive. I think that's the point. They're not part of the Force, um, and so they don't have that special quality that we do. They don't have that which they don't have free will. They don't have imagination. They just they just exist by their programming, and they are to be bought and sold. Um, From the Ashes does make a good point just there. Chewbacca does save C3PO when he's blasted to bits in Empire Strikes Back. That is true. That is true. So maybe there is some more affection than I'm giving credit for. They really enjoyed their game on the Millennium Falcon, their board game. C3PO and Chewbacca, great friends now. So let's see. Thank you for again, Vulpes. Really enjoyed that super chat. Ellen Hutter, 1838, for £10. Thank you very much. Is the Confederacy of Independent Systems in conflict against the Republic a play on the US Civil War? The fact that the CIS use droids and the Republic use clones, i.e., immigrants. I think that's a very fair comparison, Ellen, especially given the names, right? The Confederacy, the Confederates, the Republic, the United States. Yeah, it seems reasonable. I don't know enough about that context to really say more, but I do think it's revealing, right? That the in so-called democracies, it's almost impossible to actually leave um, without repercussion. That's one of the remarkable things about Brexit, in a way that um, it took many years to after the referendum to actually get it through, and we're still getting punished for it by the European Union and anybody who wants to leave will get continually punished. But that's relatively minor. We didn't have military conflict, probably because we're big enough to avoid that. But you can see that in in general, if it means that a country is going to lose power, it's very it's almost impossible to succeed. We see this in the United States at the moment. There's a lot of people who I think would support succession now, given the division within the United States. But it's almost completely off the table for the elites in power. They just don't countenance it. And if you did try it, I think that it would get very bloody, unfortunately. And this is a so-called democracy. But yes, I think that's a very good comparison, and it would be interesting for people who actually, I don't know enough about it, but if people who do know about the American Civil War should do an analysis of Star Wars in that regard. It'd be interesting to see what comes through of it. What there'll be more parallels, I'm sure. Prince of Parma, thank you very much for 14. What is ZAR? I have no idea. Let me see. South African Rand, thank you very much, sir. Thank you. So let's see. A truck question. Favorite colored lightsaber? Hmm. I think blue. I've always had a. I mean, blue's my favorite color, and I've always had a soft spot for the blue one. Especially, I think because it was Obi-Wan's, and Obi-Wan is one of my favorite characters. Um, yeah, yeah, I'd say blue. Let's see. Can I I'm gonna try something. I'm gonna try something and see if it works. The power of YouTube. Can I? Okay. Okay, I'm going to put in the chat a poll. Now your turn, guys. What is your favorite lightsaber? And everybody need everybody have a vote. Have a vote quickly. It's going to end very soon. While that's going, let me turn to the next super chat, and once I've dealt with that, I'll end the poll. So, Lady of Shalott, great to see you. Glad you could join the stream. I know this is very early for you out in Australia, so much appreciated. For 449 GBP. The pre-Raphaelites, William Morris, and the writer Thomas Hardy feared the coming rise of the machine in the 20th century and saw its threat to mankind. Oh, most definitely. And I think that was one of the interesting things about how people across the political spectrum, socialists, reactionaries like Carlyle, there was a kind of unity around this point that mechanization, industrialization, the turn from local businesses to big industry, and the assembly line approach to life totally uproots local communities. It demolishes simple ways of life for that which can be purely defined in utilitarian forms. Indeed, as Jacques Ellul would say, in terms of efficiency, we need to drive everything towards making it more efficient. And so if this custom gets in the way, you get rid of it. If this village gets in the way, you build over it, and so on. And also the dislocation of whole communities where people were being forced to move to the cities to find work. So destroying common identity and really just making everybody into atoms. I think they saw this, and we've discussed this in the past with Tolkien, and how the chapter "The Scouring of the Shire" really shows this. The Shire is a rural, pastoral delight, a very simple way of life enjoyed by distinct people with their own common identity and community. In time, Saruman, through the greed of Lotho Pimple, is able to bring in big industry, factories, and mechanization, destroying the beautiful countryside, forcing the hobbits to produce more product, which is not for themselves, but being sent away to the military industrial complex of Isengard, and their way of life, their customs being outlawed because it's not productive, it's not efficient. Uh, this is the vision that so many thinkers had, C.S. Lewis as well, and it just runs totally against this progressivism which sees technology as the solution to all things. It's I think is one of the key issues which side you're on. There doesn't seem to be much of a middle ground. You either think the implementation of technology across society, and by technology I don't just mean like a hand tool, right? I mean something like a phone, a computer, something which can perform tasks by itself as a good thing and necessarily going to lead to um, utopia, or the means of dystopia. So yes, thank you very much for that. Um, uh, and oh, let's see. Did I just lose the poll? I just ended the poll, but it's disappeared. I think blue was winning on 50%, but I could be totally wrong on that. Where did it go? Does anybody know where the poll went? Wow, this is top. Let's see. This is top technological skills here being on display. Oh, here we go. It's just popped up now. 53% green, 30% red, blue 15, purple 0. No massive Mace Windu fans in the audience tonight, I'm afraid. Uh, yes, and oh, we've got another super chat. Thank you, guys. I really do appreciate it. Enlightened Despot, hello, hello. Thank you for your $10. Not a huge fan of Star Wars. The script writing is so weak, the characters so thin, with that nauseating pro-democracy drivel. But cheers, cheers. Well, thank you for your dollars. I much appreciate it. And I will say this: I think, I've been getting into themes, but the only theme which was critical to the plot was in the original Star Wars, the anti-tech stuff. The original Star Wars, I think, is really, as a plot, it's probably the best one. The themes marry up with the narrative, and you don't really need deep characters for a fairy tale. I think you find problems, say, with like Return of the Jedi, where the key emotional drama, which is whether Luke will be able to redeem Vader, has really nothing to do with the major conflict, which is over the Death Star. It's immaterial what happens to Luke and Vader, whether the Death Star is destroyed or not. So I think there's a particular weakness there. But I think I think it's enjoyable because it does point towards things such as the need for the spiritual, the transcendent, tied in with a kind of hero's journey that's missing from a lot of modern life, but it's situating it within a modern world, indeed an advanced future. So we can at least see it gives us a glimpse of those things which are important. And so I think that's kind of what gets people going about it. But it can go too far. It can go way too far. I'd be mentioning how the Jedi, their code is almost a representation, a simulacra of the will of the Force. And there's this idea that the simulacra can become its own reality, hyper reality, totally detached from its origin. And when people like, there's this guy called Star Wars Theory, seems a nice enough guy. I was watching a video the other day where he said what Disney did to Star Wars was blasphemy because people now see Star Wars as their religion. And I just thought to myself, wow, that is an example of the simulacra. Star Wars at its best is an imitation of what's real in life, the good things in life. These people are um, moving towards seeing Star Wars as more important than real life, as the focal point of real life. The whole relationship's been inverted. There's something very um, well, I find it kind of idolatrous, but at the same time, it's also peak individualism, because again, it's you get to choose your identity through your alliance to a commercial product. That is that's not it's not life giving in that respect, because it's an imitation of an imitation of the real. So that is all the super chats. We have some time to go through the chat, so let me have a look at what people have been saying. And thank you again for all your engagement, guys. I'm grateful. Will Stepto, good to see you, sir. Uh, I heard that the first person to send a super chat exceeding 1 million will be allowed to shoot first. Can you confirm if there is any truth to this rumor? I think it's 100 million, excess of 100 million. Thank you again, Ellen, for your very kind super chat. Much appreciated. Let's see. Hello, Saint of Chelsea, Thomas Carlyle. Good evening, sir. Luca Finn, 99, LP. The Lucas trilogy is amazing. Attack of the Clones is probably the most interesting one. That's interesting. I personally find Attack of the Clones the least interesting one, actually. This is something that's really interesting about Star Wars, though, is that there is a wide range of opinion on what the best ones are. I do enjoy them all, though. The first six. I will happily sit through any of them. Zero World, hello. Hello, Shia Tori. Good to see you, sir. Ashes from the Ashes. An earlier Lucasfilm was THX 1138, which features a dystopian future society where people are enslaved by technology. Yeah, and I really hope to watch that soon. I think you can definitely see how that bled into Star Wars then. So I look forward to engaging with that in the future. Maybe it'll be a stream one day. Thanks for mentioning it. Quick note, you have the Force and the Living Force, which enacts its will through visions, animals, and people, i.e. Anakin. Okay, so the Force is the energy, but the Living Force is a kind of further manifestation of it, I suppose? Is that kind of what you're saying, Shai Tori? That the Living Force has its own will? Again, it's living. I think that's the really interesting thing, that there's life in the Force, whereas technology is, well, dead is the wrong word. It's just not alive. It isn't anything. And this is the choice we have before us. We either engage with the sacred order, or we exist on a purely materialist level, and thus do not have life in all its fullness. The Force is sort of like animism, then. Yeah, you see, I was playing around with that word. I'm not totally sure though, because if we think of something like well, let me make sure I've got the definition right. So animism is the belief that objects, places, and creatures all possess a distinct spiritual essence. See, I think it's more than that in a sense, because this isn't something which, like, a tree has a spiritual character. It's rather that all things share, or something emerges from the existence of all life together. So it's a collective energy or spirit. So it's maybe a version of animism or connected to it, but it's not quite the same. Whereas the Lord of the Rings, for example, has a much more animistic character, where you have mountains and trees having personalities. That to me is a bit more animistic. But it's on that trajectory. From the ashes, Lucas said that he drew on religion mythology to create Star Wars as the modern myth to teach morality to children. That definitely comes through. Hello, Vingle. Hello, Glaucon. See, this is one of, again. It's not clearly defined, I think, in the films. You have this discussion of the light and the dark side of the Force, but it definitely seems like the Force has agency, that it has a will. If it has a will, then it has a kind of moral imperative. Then it's kind of directing things one way and not another. So then it becomes, there's a certain morality to it. I mean, this connects to the Thefro dilemma. Is something good because the Force wills it? If so, it's arbitrary. If it's good and that's why the Force wills it, then it must be something else which defines it as good. This is the classic kind of theistic question or polytheistic question. But I do think that there is some kind of directionality and thus morality in there. Let's move forward a wee bit. Hello, Connor. Good to see you, sir. Thank you for tuning in. And RCW. Herlock Shomes. Where I live, the birds you hear are mainly rooks and seagulls. Not too dissimilar from here, my friend. It's Vingle. Are you referring to the picture in the top corner here in the up on my shelves? Because that is a picture of birds, seabirds, indeed. Let me get it down. A lot of local. It's a local artist, and we have lots of seabirds here, and I love them all. This is my favorite, the cormorants. We've got lots of them around these parts, and I did a video a few weeks ago where I tried to get footage of them, and none of them were where they normally nest, which was very frustrating. But one day I will get lots of pictures for you of the cormorants and discuss their life because it's so fascinating. Blade Runner paints a bleak picture of technology as well. There's a sort of hybris nemesis theme with the replicants attacking the humans that created them. Indeed, and Blade Runner could be its own stream. I think it's noticeable that many authors at this time or filmmakers were having the same concern about technology and its relationship to humanity. And the thing in that film, of course, is that the replicants in many ways are much more human than the humans. So it's a kind of reversal of the droids in Star Wars. But the reversal, it's more a criticism then of the system that the humans live in is not conducive to humanity, like being fully human. Moving forward a wee bit. Yes, an ant stream will be good. Wilf, possibly. I will try. Oh, so many good comments here. Yes, this is the point about the clones and the droids. Miot Yori, that they are totally interchangeable. There is nothing distinct about them, and so we can just drop one group in for another. This is what modern industrialization wants, right? Treats all human beings as the same, undifferentiated matter, and so we can move one group here and one group there, and it makes no difference. Of course, we know that's not right. The Naboo know that when they're invaded by the droids, but when you start just having clones and droids, there's nothing more to it. Biarki. The Berserkers weren't ecstatic. They were trained in high-impact fighting from a young age. Indeed. I think it's the mythology of the berserker, as we see with Snorri in his writings, and its connection with the Odinic spirit that I was referring to. The actual reality, I think, is, it wouldn't be necessarily like that. Um, but there is this idea of um, divine fury and religious frenzy as being related. And I thought that the berserkers definitely have a connection to that as the warriors of Odin. Whether in reality that's true, I'm, I'm happy to concede the point to you, Biaki. Um, I'm going to skip forward a wee bit here because we're getting perilously close to our end time. So, uh, yes, this is our current system. We're run by C3POs, literally. I feel like that all the time. Uh, Ellen Hutter. Yes, I've never. I don't really know KOTOR. I'm afraid, but I do know that it does fill a lot of the backstory out. Um, but I think that's, see, this is the thing. You can understand decisions given these sorts of sources, but if you're just watching the film, it doesn't. You don't have all of that background necessarily as a viewer. You can't presuppose it, and so when we see the Sith, well, the Jedi trying to arrest a political leader for his religious beliefs, we've got to take it on face value. Um, I think in this sort of discussion, but if we were including extended materials, oh, that opens a whole other world and probably a much richer one in some ways. Right, Honourable Fez, good to see you. Could Qui-Gon maintain control of the Jedi without pursuing power? Hmm. I I think there could there could be a way he could do it just by force of character. He could be the charismatic leader who follows the will of the Force, i.e., his decisions, which he sees as being the will of the Force, get to be those which determine the Jedi Order. And certainly that kind of model has worked in the past. Whether he would be able to compete with Darth Sidious and the issues around the Republic, I think, would be a different question. And indeed, somebody pointed it out um, later, but I think it's definitely been it's an issue that I would need to think more about. Essentially, Herlock Sholmes. In A New Hope, I get the impression that the lightsaber is perceived as an outdated weapon and the blaster pistol as a modern or practical weapon. Indeed, it's ancient religions and ancient weapons is what Han says. So there is very much this kind of out with the old, in with the modern. Technological progress will see us through. Utility is all that's needed. I do think this is also reflective of the shifting nature of war. In our own, um, in our own history, I've been reading the Iliad lately. Something that strikes me about it, you have all these great warriors, using handheld weapons, but they all have names, right? So they're not just uh, homogenous and replaceable, undifferentiated. Homer spends a lot of time telling you who's in the battle, their name, their lineage, their culture, and so on. And I think this reflects the age of heroes, that it's to do with courage and bravery and fury and skill that you can win in battle. Whereas as we move forward, especially in something like World War One and onwards, soldiers are no longer known by their names, really. They're just units to be moved around, firing guns at each other. Of course, there is bravery and courage and so on, but the character, the personal, the great man who is able to conquer his foes no longer exists in that way because it's been fully mechanized. It's fully within a system, and the individual can only do so much. So we could see the Jedi and the lightsaber as a remnant of that heroic age, like the Iliad, and so they don't quite fit in with the modern world of blasters and so on. Indeed, Obi-Wan says a weapon for a more civilized age. Hardy focuses on the destruction of the pastoral way of life by mechanized farming a great deal in his writing. I will need to read a bit more into him, but yes, I think that's definitely there in what we've been looking at. Thinkers also focused on the mechanization of war, which would be seen in World War One, which Tolkien thought, of course. Indeed, and just been mentioning that and how that really drains the heroic character in place of homogenous droids, essentially. Sadly. Hello, Byron Brand, Stepwise. Good to see you. I always played with green in Jedi Academy. Fair play, sir. I wonder what psychologically we could say about each of us depending on our colors. Airlock Sholmes, it's kind of weird that Yoda has a green lightsaber. It's like if I had a Caucasian colored lightsaber. yes, I suppose so. Um, you like the first one? Oh, amazing. I, that's one thing that I really think must have been great back in the 70s and so on, when all of these great films were coming out, these franchises, for the first time, original ideas. They're not just repeats of things that we get now or sequels or whatever. It must have been a great time to go to the cinema and see on the big screen all of these things. I do not remember this, but I'll take your word for it. Thank you for those who have tuned in. Let's see, Enlightened Despot. It's more Mayan, sky, earth, underworld to which men are totally connected and influenced. In their case, through blood and sacrifice. Yeah, I mean, minus the blood and sacrifice, that would make sense. The fully integrated, and kind of in connection with all things. That definitely sounds like the Force. I return to this idea as well that Paul referencing a Greek thinker of in it we live and move and have our being. And there's definitely a connection there as well. So I think you could probably draw on a few areas for it. Sith, we haven't even talked about them really. We've been focusing on the Jedi, unfortunately. Maybe in a future stream we'll come to whether the Sith are based or not. Sith cringe or Hut based? Jabba the Hutt super based, yeah. It's much appreciated, my friend. Much appreciated. Can only dip in out of themes. Well, it's much appreciated that you do tune in anyway. It's much, and same with you, Ellen. Yes, this is an excellent point, and I think it just gives so much more meaning to things because if you have a name, well, somebody gave you a name. You don't just pop up into the world with a name already. You're given one, and so that implies relationship, and what determines where your name comes from and those relationships? Well, family, community, history, heritage, culture, and so on. So all of these things get bound up with an object or a person and tells you so much about who they are, where they've come from, the values of their people before you've even spoken to them. Whereas if you're a serial code, you've got a number, what does that tell you? What, that you're just a unit that can be replaced? That you've got an object which is replicable? It's a presentist sort of thing. So I think that's a great point that you make. Hello, Philippocrit. Good to see you. And uh, I wanted to advertise something on your behalf, if you don't mind. Uh, so, my good friend here, Philippocrit, has written a novel, The House of Noth. And as you can see, it's very good, beautiful. It's a fantasy book with. I've been really enjoying it so far. I'm about 60 pages in. I started reading it last night, and I'm totally invested in it. A few chapters in, totally invested. I would thoroughly recommend it. I think it's very moving in many ways, and it's got some beautiful illustrations. You know, got a nice illustration there. So I would definitely recommend you folks go and buy this book, and it's uh, it's uh, we're going to be doing a stream on it together in the future. One of our Tuesday shows. We'll be chatting about the themes and influences. And so this is a good chance. If you can get the book beforehand and read it, then that's going to, help you for that stream. But I also want to advertise. I'm not getting paid for this, by the way. Edward White has written. He's also in our sphere. He came to the Shieldings event, the Witten. He's written a book called Escape from Labyrinth, which is again another fantasy story, and he's just releasing the sequel to this book as well, and he will also be on the channel I think he'll be on in December. We'll be discussing again some of the themes in his book, but also, and the same with Philippocrit, the process of writing in relation to tradition and so on. Philippocrit, I see you're in the chat. Is there a link that I can use to, put in the chat for people to use? Let's see. I'm going to your Roots of the Day channel here. Roots of the Day. Is this the right place? Oh, here we go. I've got a link for it. I've got a link. Here we go. So you can buy the book there, the House of Noth. It's £7, bargain, mate, bargain. And yeah, you should definitely purchase it. It will be worth your time. It really will be. Yeah, so I think that takes us to the end of the comments. Thank you all so much for your engagement. I've really enjoyed this. I hope you have too. We may come back to Star Wars again in the future, maybe with some guests as well, to talk about more reactionary themes. There's plenty out there. We've only just scratched the surface. Till next time, may the Force be with you always. Good night, friends.